My name is Ron Dobin. I'm an alcoholic. Appreciate Bob asking me to do this. Appreciate Kevin picking me up at the airport. Appreciate some people coming. You know, if you're going to come here and talk, it's good there's a few people to talk to. My sobriety date is September 21st, 1976. Thank you. In my first meeting sober, a man stood up and he took a cake for 30 years. His name was Bob McCullum. He was sober longer than I was alive. Blew me away. Just blew me away. And Bob became my mentor during my first year of sobriety. And when I was sober for a year, I asked him to be my sponsor. And we used to pal out together. And, one thing I used to always say to Bob, every time we'd get together, I'd say to him, you know you're sober longer than I'm alive? And he'd go, yeah, I realize that. Now, I got a kid that's sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, and she got sober when I was 22 years sober, and she was 22 years old at the time. And I'd have all these kids that would come over to the house, and they'd look at me and they'd say, Ron, do you know you're sober longer than I'm alive? And I found out it's not as great a compliment as I used to think it was. But when I was sober for 35 days, I just want to say this story because there's a lot of new people here. When I was sober for 35 days, I went to a meeting with Bob McCullum. I picked him up, took him to the meeting, and it was a speaker meeting like this one. And very similar, they had a coffee break between all the readings and when the speaker got up. And we get to the coffee break, and there's some guy there with 2 days of sobriety. And Bob nudges me, and he says, Ron, you go help that guy with 2 days. And I looked at him and I said, why don't you go help him? You're the guy with 30 years. And he looked at me and he said, Ron, he's not going to understand 30 years of sobriety. But he'll sure understand 35 days of sobriety. He said, so you go up to that man and you tell him your name and you tell him what you've done to obtain and maintain sobriety for 35 days. And in my life, I've been sponsored by old timers my whole sobriety, and I've had 9 sponsors, and I've asked each one of them a ton of really dumb, stupid questions. And I asked Bob a dumb, stupid question when he said, "You go help that guy." I said, "Why should I do that?" And he looked at me and he gave me what I believe Alcoholics Anonymous is all about. He said, do that because that way you might get 36 days. And I've never forgot that lesson. I've never forgot that lesson. I work with a lot of people in Alcoholics Anonymous. Do a lot of things in Alcoholics Anonymous. The only reason is so I don't have to go back out and drink again. That's the reason behind it. I don't have to go back out and drink again. I remember sitting at one of those early meetings. I'm sober certainly less than a week, and somebody made a statement at that meeting, and what that was, they said if I was an alcoholic, there were only 3 things that could ever happen to me or any alcoholic. Anybody sitting in this room, there's only 3 things that can ever happen to us. They said the one thing that would happen to us is we would die from the disease of alcoholism, or what they called a related disorder, which was something like a car accident or a drug deal that went bad. They said number 2 is we'd be locked up in jail or a mental institution for the rest of our lives. And number 3 is we'd get sober and we'd stay sober. And when they said that, I said a 2-word sentence. First word was bull. And I shook my head. No way. Because I thought they were just trying to con the newcomers. I really did. And if you're new in this meeting and you get the feeling that people are watching you in this meeting, let me tell you why that is. It's because we're watching you. It is. It is. We watched the newcomers, and they watched me. They watched me go bull. And 2 guys came up to me after that meeting, and they said, you don't believe that, do you, Ron? And I said, no. I said, you're just trying to scare us. And they said, no, we're not. They said, alcoholism is a progressive illness. It gets worse. It never gets better. They said, look back on your life. Is your life worse now than it was a year or 2 or 3 ago? And you see, I couldn't argue with them at that point. I couldn't argue with them at that point. I started to drink when I was 13 years old. I picked up my first drink. Al was talking about drinking with his brother. That's what happened to me. I grew up in a little beach town in New York called Rockaway Beach. My family was a member of a beach club, and I was this little lame kid, and my brother was a little lame kid too. And we're out on the sand throwing a football around on the sand. And this kid comes running up to us, and he had stolen a quart of scotch from his parents. And none of the three of us had ever drank before. So we decided we're going to go into a locker and drink some of this scotch. And we get in the locker, and we uncork the thing, and I looked at my little brother. I said, "Go ahead, Michael, you go first." And he takes a little sip of it. He goes, "Man, that's no good." And I looked at the other guy. I watched my brother for a minute or so, and nothing happened to him. He didn't go in convulsions or anything. So I looked at the other guy. I said, "Go ahead, you take some." And he took a little sip of it, and he said the same words. He said, "Man, that's no good." I figured, okay, my turn now. And if you've been in AA any amount of time, you've heard people talk from podiums, and they say they took the first drink, and it hit bottom, and it went boom when it hit bottom. That is not what happened to me. That is not what happened to me. What happened to me is I took that first drink, and it tastes like crap. And I could not understand why my parents would drink that stuff. And I said the same words these guys said. I said, "Man, that stuff tastes terrible." And then for maybe 2 or 3 or 5 minutes, the three of us sat there and we giggled. And we said what big men we were, because we now had a drink of whiskey. And for that 2 or 3 or 5 minutes that we were sitting there, all of us said over and over, "Man, this stuff tastes terrible." And then I looked at these other two guys and I said, "You know what? Let me try one more." And I took the second one, and I looked at my little brother. I said, "Michael," I said, "you ought to try the second one. The second one tastes real good." Now, I don't know to this day if he drank any more. I have no clue. I started chug-a-lugging on that bottle. I came to that night. I was at home. I was in my parents' bed. I had cuts and scrapes all over my body. My brother told me I tried to crawl home from that beach club. Don't remember doing it. Don't remember doing this either. I just remember the consequences of it. This was a family beach club, and my parents shared a cabana with their best friends. And I threw up on my mother's best friend, and this lady had no sense of humor at all. None. You know, I mean, I think that's pretty cute, a little 13-year-old projectile vomits on you, but she didn't. She called home, and the next day I got dragged back there. And I said something to that lady. I said to a lot of people after that. And what I told this lady, I said, "I'm sorry for what I did yesterday, but I was drunk and I'm never going to drink again." That was the first time I ever took a drink. When I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the other things they said, if I be alcoholic, I had a physical allergy to alcohol. They said there are some alcoholics that can drink socially for X amount of years. They can go out and have a drink or 2 or 3 or whatever, go home, not have any problems or anything else. And then it's like there's an invisible line somewhere, and they cross over this invisible line from social drinking into alcoholic drinking. I don't know anything about social drinking. About the closest I ever got to social drinking is if I was in the proximity of anybody that drank, I said, "So shall I." That's as close to social drinking as I ever got in my life. I drank alcoholically right from the get-go. My family would get invited to a wedding or something after that. I learned my lesson. You don't drink scotch. But I drink these little kid drinks, you know, like vodka and orange juice or something. And they'd find me in the bathroom, and I'd be throwing up or I'd be passed out by the toilet. And that was every time I drank. Didn't do a whole lot of drinking as a mid-teenager, and the reason I didn't is I grew up in the 60s. In the 60s, we did not do a lot of drinking. If there's any people here that grew up in the 60s, they know we didn't do a lot of drinking. It's not that we went to AA meetings, it's that we took drugs. And at 16 years old, I started to take drugs, and I took drugs the same as I drank. I did it alcoholically. I heard Johnny Harris say something one time when he spoke, and man, I was just so able to identify with it. And what that was, and it was the same in my life. People would come to me with different things, and they'd say, "Ron, take this. You'll go on a trip like you've never been on, man. Take this." Never once in my life did I look at any one of those people and go, "Could that hurt me?" Or you think there might be some effects in later life? I mean, I just get it down, and anyway, by the time I'm 17 and a half years old, I'm getting thrown out of my house at a pretty regular basis, kind of like what Al was talking about. I'm in, I'm out, I'm in, I'm out. And growing up in New York, we got a lot of apartment houses, so my family would throw me out, and I'd go camp out on a rooftop next door or down the block or whatever, and, then I'd get back in the house, worm my way back into the house, and start getting in trouble, and they threw me out again. When I'm 18 years old, they threw me out for good, and I moved into Greenwich Village. I lived in hippie communes. I lived on the streets for about 2 years. And 2 years later, the people that I was staying with decided that they wanted to move to Haight-Ashbury. And I don't know the reason or remember what it was, but for some reason I decided I wasn't going to go with them. And I called home, hadn't spoken to my family in a couple of years, and they were good people, and they said, yeah, you can come back, you just got to straighten out your act. And I said, okay. And I moved back in, and 3-4 days later, they're throwing me out again for the same crap. And I called my grandparents. My grandparents were elderly people. I didn't want to live back on the streets again. And my grandparents were elderly people, and they took me in. And I wanted to stay sober. There's a story in the big book about a guy who, because of business reasons, when he's 25 years old, his alcoholism had not progressed that much, and he was able to stop drinking. And he retired when he was 55 and started drinking again, and then he couldn't stop. Well, at 20 years old, my alcoholism had not progressed that much, and I moved in with my grandparents, and I stopped what I was doing. I just stopped what I was doing. And my grandfather got me a job as a sales trainee for a company in the Empire State Building. And I worked there for about 6 months, and then I found this other job as a salesman in New York City. And I went to work for that company, and the company saw that I had some talent in that business. And I was working there certainly less than a year, maybe 9 months, something like that. And they decided to promote me, and they made me what they called a junior manager. A year later, they decided that what they wanted to do was open an office out on Long Island, in Hempstead, Long Island. And they came to me and they said, would you do that, Ron? And I said, yeah. And and I opened the branch, and if you've ever been in management, if you hire good people, they make you look good. That's what happened to me. I got lucky. I hired some good people. And maybe another year goes past, and they name me area sales manager. And when I'm 25 years old, they name me national sales manager of that firm. They had offices all over the country. They had offices in New York City, the one out in Long Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Texas, and California. They moved my wife and I from New York out to the Los Angeles area of California, and I ran the whole show. I'm making more money than my father ever dreamed of making in his life. I didn't grow up in poverty by any stretch of the imagination. I grew up in a middle-class home. I've got hundreds and hundreds of people that are working for me, and I thought, man, I've arrived. I've arrived. And I started to drink again. I watched my family do that, watched my dad do that. He would go to work, and at the end of the day, he'd come home, and he and my mom would sit down, they'd have a drink, and then she'd go off into the kitchen and make dinner. And I figured, that's what a man's supposed to do. So I went out, and I worked hard all day, and I'd come home. My wife and I would sit down, and we'd have a drink together. She'd go off into the kitchen to make dinner, and I'd have a second drink, and then a third. Then I'd say, hey, I'm going out, and, it's on again, and I'm back in trouble again. When I came here to Alcoholics Anonymous, I told you at one of those first meetings, man said to me, look back on your life. Is your life worse now than it was a year or two or three ago? And I said I couldn't argue. Couldn't argue. This was when I was 25 years old that they named me National Sales Manager. I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was 28 years old. I was unemployed, and I was unemployable again. I'd been that way for a year and a half. I had hair down to here again. I had a long beard. I didn't bathe every day. I was in a lot of trouble due to drinking. The thing that I remember most about my drinking, the last 2 years of it, was trying to stop drinking. I knew I was an alcoholic. I knew I was an alcoholic for 2 years before, maybe 3 years before I ever got to Alcoholics Anonymous. My wife and I went to a party one night, and this person had the 20-question test at that party. And we're just sitting there getting ripped, and this guy says, hey, why don't you take this test? And for people that are new, if you've never seen it, it's put out by John Hopkins, and it asks you 20 questions about your drinking. And on the bottom of this thing, it says if you answered yes to any one of these questions, there's a possibility you could be an alcoholic. And if you answered yes to 2 of these questions, there's a better chance you're an alcoholic. If you answered yes to 3 of these questions, you're definitely an alcoholic. So I'm sitting there and I take the test and I get 17 yeses. So I knew I was an alcoholic, but I also knew that somehow, some way, someday, I'd be able to control this. And the funny thing is, that's what our book says. It says there's one thing that we all have in common. One thing only. You don't have to come here in the shape I came here or other people came. It makes no difference. It says the great obsession of all abnormal drinkers is that somehow, someday, he or she will be able to control and enjoy their drinking. And that's all I wanted to do. All I wanted to do was stop, just stop. I was a blackout drinker, the same as I was when I was 13 years old and I took my first drink. I was also a drunk that had horrible, horrible hangovers. So what would happen to me is I'd go on a drunk and I'd come to the next day or 2 days later or whatever it is, and if I'm at home, the bed is just soaked with sweat. And how I know I'm awake is I have a headache. It's the only way I know I'm awake. I have a headache, and it feels like pins just shooting off in the middle of my brain. And I remember I would lay there with my eyes closed with this horrible, horrible headache. And a couple of minutes later, I'd get this feeling in my stomach, and it was pressure. And the pressure would get worse and worse and worse until I say to myself, you better get into the bathroom quick. And then I'd get into the bathroom and I'd be sick. And then I would stand up next to the vanity mirror and I'd look in my own eyes. And I'd tell myself, I am never going to do this again. I will never be this sick. I will never be this hungover. I will never, ever do this again. And I meant that with every fiber of my being. With everything I had, I meant that. And that was at whatever time it was that I would come to, 6 in the morning, 8 in the morning, 10 in the morning, whatever time it was, I would go through that. And somewhere that afternoon, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock that afternoon, I'd be thinking to myself, Ron, it really wasn't all that bad last night. I'd do the same thing over again. Same thing over again. Now, that happened to me every single day in September of 1976. September 1st, 2nd, 3rd, every one of those mornings I came to and said, I'll never do it again, meant it with everything I had, and I'd be drunk that day. Be drunk that day. On the night of September 21st, I went on a drunk, and I came off that drunk the next morning, and I remember saying to me, I can't stop. I'm going to be drunk today, and I don't want to be drunk today. And that scared me. That scared me more than anything had ever scared me in my life before or since. The total realization that no matter how much I wanted to be sober, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it for even 24 hours. And I thought back to a telephone conversation I had had with my mother probably 5 years earlier than this. She had told me about a friend of hers that was a member of AA that was sober for a year. They were going to this thing that night called an AA birthday party to celebrate this lady's year of sobriety. And I thought, she went to Alcoholics Anonymous and she stayed sober for a year. Maybe if I go to Alcoholics Anonymous, maybe I can stay sober 3 or 4 days. That's what I came here looking. Maybe I can get 4 days in a row without a drink somehow. And 2 weeks ago, that was 30 years ago. So Alcoholics Anonymous has worked in my life. Alcoholics Anonymous has worked in my life. The reason Alcoholics Anonymous has worked in my life is because I've worked Alcoholics Anonymous. A couple of things I want to talk about. One is, when I first got here, one of the things I was told is go to a lot of meetings and get involved in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I go to a lot of meetings, and I am involved in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I told you I had that guy, Bob McCullum. He was my mentor during the first year. When I first came in, I had a sponsor by the name of Jim Tiernan, and I could run a lot of games on Jim. Now, I also, when I got here, I wasn't working, and I wasn't looking to go to work. This is great to say in Las Vegas, but as well as having a drinking problem, being an alcoholic, I also had this slight gambling problem. And I would go to the racetrack every single day. And I could just run a lot of games on this guy, Jim Tiernan. Well, there was this other guy that used to go to meetings with us all the time, and his name was Ernie Fox. And when I was sober for 3 months, I asked Ernie to be my sponsor also, because I knew that I wasn't getting enough from Jim. I just knew it. And I went up to Ernie one day after a meeting, and I said to him, and Ernie would always talk to me at the meetings, and he just seemed like this real nice guy. He was an elderly guy, not as elderly today as I thought he was then, but he was somewhere in his mid-60s, I guess, and Ernie was probably about 5'7", 5'8", 5'9", somewhere in there, maybe 150 pounds. He'd come up to me after a meeting, he'd put his arm around my shoulders. He'd say, "You just hang in there, Ron. You're going to find a way to live where you don't have to drink anymore. And if I can ever help you, let me know." And I always appreciated that. So I'm sober for 3 months, and I figure, I need more than Jim. I'll get Ernie to be my sponsor also. So I go up to him. I said, "Ernie," I said, "would you be my sponsor?" He said, "I sure will, Ron." He said, "My last name is Fox." He said, "You look my telephone number up in the telephone directory and give me a call." And he said, "What's your last name, Ron?" He said, "This way I can look your number up and give you a call." And I said, "Well, my last name is Dobin, Ernie." I said, "But my phone number happens to be unlisted." And in that second, Ernie turned from this meek little guy to Godzilla. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And he starts screaming at me. And he says to me, he says, "If I'm going to be your sponsor," he says, "you are going to list your phone and you're going to start paying your damn bills." And I remember thinking to myself, how does he know the only reason I have an unlisted phone? I owe everybody in the world money. I mean, I owe everybody in the world money. The last year that I drank, last 6 months that I drank, I remember one morning my wife goes downstairs to drive somewhere, and she comes running up in tears that somebody had stolen her car. So she wakes me up, and when you're hungover, and somebody stole my car. So I got sober in Pasadena, and so I call the Pasadena Police Department. I start screaming at this female officer, while those damn cops last night were eating free donuts on my tax dollars that I haven't paid in years, but still, they were eating these free donuts. Somebody came in and stole my wife's car. She says, "Hold on, Mr. Dobin." She comes back on the phone. She says, "No, your car was repossessed last night for non-payment." Now, that's embarrassing. About a month after that, we got a knock on the door, and 2 guys carried our refrigerator out. I'm going to tell you, I'm married to the same woman for 36 years. I love her with all my heart. But if you're in a relationship and you want to piss your wife off, get her refrigerator repossessed. They don't understand that. They are not forgiving. I mean, they really get angry behind that stuff. So Ernie tells me, he says to me, "You're going to go out and you're going to get a job." And like I said, my initial thought was, how does he know? My second thought was, I'll kill him. Who does he think he is talking to me that way? He doesn't have a right. I'm twice his size. I mean, the guy's 5'7", he's 65 years old. All I got to do is hit him once, and that's the end of that. And as I'm thinking of killing him, I hear come out of my mouth, "Okay, Ernie, I'll go get a job." And I go get this stupid job. He calls me up. He says, "Ron, did you get a job?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "How often are you paid?" I said, "I'm paid every other week." He says, "I'll be over." Now, I thought I had to pay the guy to be my sponsor. I don't know. He shows up at the house. He says to me, "You were telling me about all these bills that you haven't paid. Do you have them?" Now, I don't know if there's any other non-bill payers here, but what I used to do, you get a bill, you put it in the drawer, because one day you might pay it, right? So I open this drawer, right? All these bills are sitting there. He says, "You're going to get every one of those people on the phone, and you're going to make payment arrangements to every single one of them." Because of that man saying that to me and teaching me about responsibility, I owe nobody anything today except my mortgage. That's it. That's it. Financially, I got better in Alcoholics Anonymous. I got another sponsor at 4 years sober, really taught me about responsibility, something, man, I had no clue about. I asked this guy to be my sponsor. I'm sober a little over 4 years. He says, let's go to a meeting one night, right? So we meet to go to the meeting. We go to this meeting. He says, meet me at 7:30. I said, okay. I show up at his house, 7:35. Now, that's not late. He looked at me. He said, Ron, he said, I showed you the courtesy of being on time. Why'd you make me wait? The man taught me about responsibility, something I didn't know about, You know, when I tell you today I'm going to do something, I do it only because of what Alcoholics Anonymous has taught me. So after coming here to Alcoholics Anonymous, I started to get better in different areas of my life. I got better physically because I didn't drink anymore. I got better materially because Ernie Fox made me go to work, and he made me start to pay my bills. But emotionally, I did not get better for a number of years. In fact, I'm of the belief, I read something in the book, Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age, which will tell you why a guy like me, sober a lot of years, is still as active as I am in this program, as active as I am. In the book Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age, there's some writings by a guy by the name of Dr. Bauer. And at the time Dr. Bauer wrote this, he was one of the heads of the American Medical Association. And what he wrote, he said, after studying the disease of alcoholism for many years, we've come to the conclusion that alcoholism is a disease of the emotions. Now, if I was a doctor, that might mean something. I'm not. I'm a layman, so I'm not a doctor. But I'll tell you what that means to me. I'll tell you how that disease of the emotions affects me in my life. And I'll tell you what I've had to do about that. Because I believe that's the message here. That's the reason that I'm still sober. How that disease of the emotions affects a guy like me is when I'm sober, not when I'm drunk. When I am sober, I become a little sensitive. And people piss me off. And you hurt my feelings very easily, especially if you're close to me. One of the ways that disease of the emotions affects me, I told you I'm married for 36 years to the same girl. Known her for probably 40. When she doesn't do what I want her to do, I think it's because she really doesn't know who I am. And then I'll show her. And then I get in trouble behind that. One of the things that happens to guys, there's a few guys here that are past 50, they know this is a fact. One of the things that happens to men as we age, we have this little gland called a prostate. And as we get older, that gets bigger, which means in the middle of the night, we've got to go to the bathroom a few times. Now, I will watch my wife every once in a while get up to go to the bathroom. And she comes back and she puts her little head on the pillow and she goes right to sleep. Now, sometimes when that disease of the emotions gets kicking in my life, I get up to go in the middle of the night. I put my little head on the pillow, and my head says, Ron, we got to talk for a while. We are in a lot of trouble, and tomorrow's the day it's going to happen. And now I'm up all night, and I'm looking at her sleeping, and I'm getting angrier and angrier. See, and I never looked at this. I never knew about this. I was sober for 4 years, and emotionally, I was still the same man sober I was drunk. And I couldn't understand why. I couldn't understand why I'd go to a meeting, and I'd sit in the meeting, and people would say real good things. And I'd say, you just apply that. Apply whatever it is that such and such said, and then everything will be okay. You'll walk in the house, you'll live in Shangri-La. And I'd walk out of the meeting and I'd drive home, and it's no more than 10 or 15 minutes from the time the meeting ended until I got to the front door. And I remember this happening one night. I'm sitting in a meeting, I listened to two people talk about their home lives, and both of them had great messages. And I thought, just apply that, you'll be fine. The fights are going to be off, everything is going to be okay at home. And like I said, it's 10 minutes from the time the meeting ended until I got to the front door. I turned the key in the front door, I walked in, and like where your sneakers are, there's a sock laying on the floor. And I'm a neat freak. And I look at my wife, and I remember saying it to her. I said, Ann, I am sober for 4 years, and you can't clean the goddamn house. And the fights are on again. And 10 minutes earlier, I'm in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous going, I'll do better. I'll do better. I remember more than once I'd go home, I'd get in a fight about something, and I leave the house, I get in my car, I drive to the meeting, I walk in the meeting, put your smile on so nobody knows anything's wrong, come in the meeting, sit there for the hour the meeting's on. If I get called on, give my little AA talk. Get in the car, drive home, and get right back into the same fight I left an hour and a half earlier. And I don't know why. I don't understand what's going on. I really don't. And a little over 4 years sober, I ran into another sponsor. I mentioned this guy, the guy that helped to teach me about responsibility. And he kind of had a message for me. He told me about this emotional illness that I shared with you. And he said, we've got a way to treat that, Ron. And I said, what's that? And he said, through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, if you will take these steps and you will apply these steps in your life, you will learn a way to live comfortably inside your own skin. And I looked at that man and I said, Bob, I know all about the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous because I had worked them at a year. And the man never argued with me. This is why I believe sponsorship is so important. The man never argued with me. He said, maybe you have worked them, but he went over to his truck and he took out the big book. And where they are, and he put his finger down on the first step, and there's a little dash between the word alcohol and that. And he put his finger down on that dash, and he said, Ron, he said, since you know so much about these 12 steps, what's this dash for? I had no idea. I never even knew it was there. I never knew it was in the sentence. In fact, I went home that night and I looked at my own book just to see if he didn't do that, just to fake out the guys he was working with. I really did. He explained to me something. I'd been in meetings all the time, at least 5 to 7 meetings a week during the first 4 years of my sobriety. Chapter 5 is read every single night. I never heard this. Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after. That's before I stopped drinking and after I stopped drinking. Make clear 3 pertinent ideas. Idea A, I am an alcoholic and cannot manage my own life. This man looked at me. He was sober 27 years at that time. He said, 27 years later, what's an unmanageable life? See, I knew my life was unmanageable while I drank. You don't go from national sales manager to unemployed bum without it looking a little unmanageable. But I also knew I was doing better when I was sober. And he explained to me that what they're talking about is my inner life, my emotional life. He said, if you don't think your life is unmanageable, Ron, he said, the next time you really get angry at somebody where you just want to tear their head off, he said, now you've asked me to be your sponsor. He said, so just call me. He said, I'll say live and let live. I'll hang up and you'll be fine. He said, you can't do that, can you? He said, or if you go home and you get a letter from the IRS and on the corner it says, audit of the Dobin family, don't open it. Just tell yourself not to worry. I said, I couldn't do that. He said, that's right. You have an emotionally unmanageable life. I believe that. I know that that's the truth. This man took me through the 12 steps. He didn't make me do them on my own. He did not make me do them on my own. Thank God he didn't. When we got through the 12 steps, he wanted to do them again. He always talked about repeated work on the 12 steps. Now, Bob died about 10 years ago. I have a sponsor today. His name is Paul Martin, lives in Chicago. Paul believes the same thing. Paul believes exactly the same thing. Repeated work on the 12 steps. Now, it's a funny thing, when we got up to step 10, when I was working with Bob and we got up to step 10, I heard something in the area that I was living in at that time that said that steps 10, 11, and 12 are what we termed the maintenance steps. That you worked the first 9 steps once and then you survived on this thing called the maintenance steps. And we get up to step 10, and Bob looked at me, or I looked at Bob, and my ego just came right out when we got to step 10. I said, we're now on the maintenance steps, Bob. I figured I'd impress him with what I knew. And the day I asked this guy to be my sponsor, he got something straight with me that I do with everybody I sponsor, because it worked for me. What he said to me the day I asked him to be my sponsor, he said, I'll be your sponsor. He said, but you don't ever lie to me. He said, and I don't ever lie to you. He said, that's our relationship. It's built on honesty. And I said, okay, that's a fair deal. And I never lied to the man. So we get up to step 10, and I said to him, I said, we're on the maintenance steps now, Bob. And he said to me, he said, Ron, he said, you called me about 2 weeks ago, and you told me you got in another fight with Ann. He said, now, were you lying or were you telling the truth? I said, no, Bob, I was telling you the truth. I said, I don't ever lie to you. He said, you also called me last week and you said you went into the office and you had a minor disagreement with your boss. Wasn't anything major, but you called me the next day because you said you didn't sleep all night, that your head just kept saying, man, you're going to go in tomorrow and get fired. You should have never said that, blah, 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 blah. Then he starts again. He says, now, were you lying or were you telling the truth? I said, Bob, I was telling you the truth. He said, then let me ask you a question. I said, what? He said, why do you want to be maintained? You know what? I don't want to be maintained today. I want more of what Alcoholics Anonymous offers me. I believe what Alcoholics Anonymous offers, what my sponsors have taught me, what's come true in my life. If this wouldn't have come true, I wouldn't be standing here 30 years after getting here. What Alcoholics Anonymous offers any alcoholic, man or woman, makes no difference, is a way to live comfortably inside of ourselves so we don't have to pick up a drink. But that, in my opinion, comes through continued work on the 12 steps. The work I did on the 12 steps 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago has nothing to do with today. Has absolutely nothing to do with today. When that man, Bob Anderson, died about 10 years ago, I got a call from his wife saying he was going to pass away. He had cancer for 8 years. And he was in the hospital the final time. And his wife called and said, Ron, if you want to see him, you're going to have to fly down to Los Angeles to say goodbye. He won't be alive in another week. And I said, okay. And I flew down to see him on a Saturday. He died the following Wednesday. And a guy that I sponsor went with me, and we walk into the room, and I sit there and I talk to Bob, and this baby of mine and Bob's wife went downstairs, and they had coffee for an hour or so, and Bob and I sat there and just shared back and forth, because the man was so instrumental in my life. And anyway, they came up to leave, and I was walking out of the room, and at that time, the man was sober for 45 years. And the last thing I said to him, I said, Bob, I said, the message you've given me in Alcoholics Anonymous, I'll carry anywhere I go, that there's an answer in 12 steps in a loving God that will allow people to live comfortably inside themselves and not pick up a drink. And he said, Ron, God bless you. He said, remember this, though. The name of this disease is alcoholism. It's not alcoholism. It don't go away because you're sober a long time. It only goes away through the continued work of the 12 steps. I am so grateful to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I thank you for having me here.